this is Mrs. Smeckens, and in this lesson series, we've been looking closely at individual characters, and we've been tracking all the details that authors provide. As authors develop a character across the text, as a reader, we're collecting each of those details. We're learning that we need to notice exactly what a character does, what a character says, and what a character thinks. But authors give us more than one character. Rarely is there a story with just one character. Usually there's at least two, and they interact. They have a relationship. Somehow they come in contact with each other. Maybe they're both trying to solve the same problem. Maybe one is the other one's problem. Maybe one is going to help the other one endure a problem. But nonetheless, there's usually more than one character. And so in this lesson, what I want to do is take what we know about tracking a character, the main character, the protagonist, and I want us to really start to look at, so what's the relationship between these characters? How do they interact? The author on purpose created two separate, or more than two, separate individual characters, developed them, but now as those two separate personalities come together, as a reader, we need to be able to make some inferences. And as soon as I say inferences, we need to be thinking about Mrs. Linder's silhouette head, because authors don't tell us how they interact. As a reader, we're supposed to figure this out. Figure out their relationship. Figure out, are they helpful for each other? Are they enemies? Are they allies? Are they competitors? We're supposed to figure that out as readers. And so it's going to require inferring. And as soon as I say inferring, we know that we're going to have to collect details and put them together. So I'm going to add Mrs. Linder's silhouette head and remind you that as we collect details about the characters individually, we're going to then have to put them together. So we're going to look at, well, what did this character think? How do they feel? What were their hopes, their dreams, their motivations? We're going to have to look at the protagonist in terms of what he actually said, or what the narration said that he argued, discussed, or explained. We're also going to have to look at the protagonist in terms of what did he do? What were his actions, his reactions, right? His decisions and choices. As we collect those individual details, and we've learned how to do that, now we have to think about them. Now we have to think about them and make some decisions, draw some conclusions. And one of the conclusions authors expect that the reader will draw is that you can kind of figure out, so what's the relationship between these characters? How do they interact, and what's their relationship? So we're really trying to answer that question in this lesson. If this character had done something a little differently, if this character had a different relationship, would the outcome have been the same? Would it have been different? Authors developed the characters individually. Now it's time to look at them and how they merge and interact with one another. And we know as soon as we start to think bigger inferences like that, we're going to have to collect details and think about them. And we're going to have to reflect on our own background knowledge, right? Our own text of self, our own memories. Well, this makes me think that their relationship is, or we're going to have to think, well, when this and this happen, these go together because I describe their interaction as, I'll give you some examples, okay? But what we have to do is collect these details and think about them in order to answer that question. So, how are these characters related? Okay, and I'm not talking about brother-sister, all right? I'm not talking about boss and employee. I'm not talking about boyfriend-girlfriend. That's part of the relationship, but that's very surface. And the author told us that, all right? What we're trying to do is figure out, how do they feel about each other? And do their feelings impact their choices, their words? How does all this fit and develop the conflict of the story? Okay, so this is what we're after. We're really after thinking through this idea of character interactions in this lesson. After we track individual characters, the protagonists, after we really look at them, then we want to look at their relationship with the other characters. So let me kind of give you some things to consider when I say look at their relationship. Like, consider what, Mrs. Smeckens? What should I be considering? Okay, so first, literally their relationship. And this could be, yes, titles, okay, boss and employee, or their spouses, or their brothers, their neighbors. Okay, but I mean more in terms of their personal relationship. Are they good for each other? Are they helpful? Are they nurturing toward each other? Do they hate each other? So just kind of get your arms around, just in general, what is their literal relationship? How do they know each other? And then how do they come in contact with each other? At the office, on the street? Are they just strangers? What is their relationship? Okay, and then does it change? Because remember, characters change over time. And so as they're enduring problems, right, and interacting with each other, do they grow and change? Is their relationship any different? Maybe they started off as colleagues and then they ended up as spouses. Maybe they started off as best friends and then they ended up as enemies. Did it change? It doesn't have to, but it could. You want to notice that. You want to think about that. You want to infer that. Okay, another facet besides just their relationship is to consider, how do they act and behave toward one another? Not just individually, what does he do, okay? What does he say? But what does he do toward that character? What does he say to that character? And how does he do it? And how does he say it? Because that's indicating relationship. And again, sometimes they can act and do things maliciously toward one character, but they're much nicer to another. So when we look at the relationship of these two characters versus these two, oh, it's very different. Very different. And so we don't just look individually at one character and what he does, says, and thinks throughout the whole story. Now we want to think about, what does this character, okay, and I'll circle this one, this character A, do and say to character B? And what does character B do and say to character C? And so this idea of looking at their interactions. So we tracked this information so we knew what details to look for, but now we're using them to make some bigger inferences. Okay, so we want to look at their relationship, and does it change? How they act toward each other, speak to each other. Does it change? Ooh, here's a good one. And do they act differently when they're in a group than they are one-on-one? Oh, see, that starts to tell you a little more about their relationship. You got to notice these things. None of those details are by accident, people. Authors put those in there. We have to notice them. Okay, relationships, behaviors, and how they think and feel about each other. Okay, so now wait a minute. One character can act this way, all right? Behave this way toward a character. But remember, what they say and do doesn't necessarily match how they feel, right? Because people can say things and they're lying. We know the truth as the reader. The narrator gives us character, thoughts, feelings, desires, hopes. We know how this character really feels, what he really thinks. So when you are looking at what is the relationship between two characters, you can't only look at what they outwardly do and literally say. You have to account for, but what do they secretly feel? What is their opinion? And it may match, but it may not. And does it change? Does it change over the course? Do they think and feel differently over the course of the whole story? These are the bigger questions we ask when we start to look at relationship and interaction between characters. All right, so now I want to introduce you to an interaction tracker, okay? And let me zoom in first because I think this is an easy way to kind of take all of these thoughts and I need to process them in order to come up with what is their relationship? How would I describe their relationship? I need a place to kind of put some of these thoughts. And yeah, I can track the do, say, think on a tracker. I can do the do, say, think in annotation or highlighting. But at some point, I need to just kind of process it. And I think nothing more than a simple chart could do it for you. I think you could process with a simple chart where all you do is kind of have a column for every character, every main character in the story. And so the main character A, or maybe there are 2 or 3 main characters, each character needs a column, okay? And so we're going to look at each character and how they relate to other characters. So it's just a chart. Now, the chart I'm going to show you on the screen is typed and it's pretty and you can print it off if you want, but I really just typed it so you could appreciate all of the pieces and how it works. You can always just create an interaction tracker with paper and a pencil, okay? All right, so that said, at the top of the interaction tracker are those 3 things you want to look at. You want to look at how the relationship, how they're related, okay, in terms of are they good for each other? Are they allies? Are they competitors? What are they? Okay, personal relationship. And then how do they act or behave? What do they actually say or do to each other? And how do they really feel about each other? And all of this is going to go into really figuring out their relationship, their how they interact and their journey together. Okay, so I've used this idea of character A, character B. Okay, so it's nothing more than a chart. Okay, that's all it is. And so character A, his name goes at the top. Character B's name goes on the other column. Okay, and so then the same characters get listed along the side. So if I go back to my homemade version here, so then character A is listed here, B is here, and C is here. For every character here, you have one here. Okay, and remember, you don't have to do the minorest of characters. We're really after the interaction and relationship that was developed. So it's the main characters. Okay, so that said, once you kind of get the chart set up, here's how it works. You're going to look at just character A all the way across. All right, so character A, how does character A feel about himself? Now, he might have actually said some things. He might have had some thoughts about himself, or it might be a whole lot of inference. But we have to kind of get at the root of, so who is character A? You don't have to put a lot of bullets in these boxes, a lot of details, but you have to consider it, okay? And then more importantly, what does A think of character B? And this is where it's in this box that you would say, so what is A's relationship to B? Okay, well, A is the boss of B, or A is the ex-girlfriend of B, or A is, it's always A's perspective of B. So if there was a name here, Susie, Susie is related to B how? Susie did what to B? Susie said what to B? Susie thinks what of B? It's always A thinks, believes, does, says this to B. Okay, then you drop down and you might have 3 bullets here of details. You might have 9 bullets, but I can tell you it's not just one. It's usually several different things because they interact, they connect, they talk and speak and act and think about each other more than once. And so watch for that and literally collect it. Just bullet that out. Okay, now it might change. Remember, how A feels about B might change as the bullets go on. So it's just messy little note-taking here, okay? Then you want to think about character B. So if Susie was character A, Matthew was character B, all right? So how does Matthew feel about Susie? What does Matthew say the relationship is with Susie? What is Matthew's actions towards Susie? See, it's not necessarily the same in A's perspective of B and B's perspective of A. They don't necessarily agree on their relationship. They might not see their relationship the same way. And that's usually a source of conflict. That's usually what they're after when they say, so how would you describe the relationship? What's their interaction? What's the rub between these characters? Okay. And then, of course, have B think about B. Have Matthew, what's Matthew's impression of himself? How does he look at himself? And so, again, just some initial thoughts. Authors aren't going to give you a lot of that, perspective of yourself, but you can start to read into it a little bit. And that also gives a lot of insight as we're looking at other characters. Okay, and again, you can do this with 3 characters. You can do this with 4 characters. And so let's just quickly, let me just kind of walk this through on Cinderella. So if we were going to look at the relationships between Cinderella, the stepmother, and the prince, okay, in this box, you would just bullet, what does Cinderella think of herself? What does Cinderella think of her stepmother? What does Cinderella think of the prince? It's always Cinderella all the way across. Then we start to look at, all right, the stepmother. What does the stepmother think of Cinderella? What does the stepmother think of herself? What does the stepmother think of the prince? And not just what do they think, but how do they act toward them? And what do they say toward them or at them? Okay? All right. And then finally, the prince. As we look at this third one, what's the prince's perspective of Cinderella? What do we know? According to the details you collected, what do we know the prince thinks about Cinderella? And what does the prince say to Cinderella? And what does the prince do for or with Cinderella? And so that's what we're collecting, all right? What's the prince's perspective of his stepmother? And keep this in mind. Some of these boxes, you'll have way more details than others. It's not a worksheet. You don't have to fill this out. The prince's perspective of himself. I don't know if we get a whole lot of that. I might leave that blank. This is not a worksheet. It's just a document to work through your thinking and be thinking about relationships, all right? But you don't have to have 6 bullets per box. It's not a worksheet, people, all right? It's just a way to process. Okay, so now I want to try this. I want to show you what this looks and feels like. And we're going to use the carpet fitter, okay, which you've read a couple different times now, all right? And if you haven't read it, then you could skim it quickly before we carry on with this video or after. But let's assume you've read it and you even marked all of the things Eddie does, says, and thinks during this whole event, okay? So you have this annotation, let's pretend. Okay, so now the question is, how would you describe the relationship between Eddie and Mrs. Vanbrugh? How would you describe well, I don't know how I would describe the relationship. I need to first stop and think about the relationship. I know all of the things that individually Eddie said, did, and thought, but I didn't really think about them directed toward Mrs. Vanbrugh. So now I'm going to do that. Okay, so I'm going to do part of this and then you're going to do part of this. All right, so let's just practice this with the carpet fitter. Try this interaction piece. All right, so let's start first with, I'm going to start, you can start anywhere. Okay, I'll start down here. Okay, what is Mrs. Vanbrugh's, or actually I'm going to start here, Mrs. Vanbrugh's perspective of Eddie? Okay, what is her perspective? Okay, well, remember, we got to think about their relationship. Up at the top there, 1, 2, 3. Those are your reminders of what you're supposed, their relationship. Well, she's the customer. And Eddie is the serviceman. Okay. What's her perspective? She hired Eddie, E, to do a job. Okay. So that's their relationship. Okay. Her perspective of Eddie, I'm thinking of near the end when he says the job's done and up here in the third column. And she says, yes, nice, very nice, dear. Thank you. And she's just kind of rushing through. So I don't know. She expects him to do a job. She's not like amazed by him. Her perspective is, she's content. He did his job, content with Eddie's work. Okay, see what I'm doing? I'm just kind of thinking through that. Does their relationship change in Mrs. Vanbrugh's mind? I don't think so. She kind of ignores him, right? She's content with this job. What's her perspective? Well, he's doing his thing, and I'm going to do mine. So Mrs. V is busy doing other things. We can assume, all right, doing other things. So that's where we are. All right. So that's how she feels toward Eddie. Now you help me with, how does Eddie feel toward Mrs. Vanbruch? All right. So I want you to help me now with the top right box here. Okay. What's Eddie's perspective of Mrs. Vanbruch? Okay. First, tell me their relationship. Eddie is what? What does Eddie feel about their relationship? What is Eddie? Yes, he's hired to fit the carpet. Okay. Eddie feels what about Mrs. Vanbruch and other people like her, clients like her? He feels unappreciated. Okay. Okay. What else is Eddie's perspective of Mrs. Vanbruch? Rich Mrs. Vanbruch, who changes her carpets every year and has to have the best. What's his opinion of her? A hoity-toity, snobby, right? Snooty. Okay, so Eddie feels that V, just use abbreviations, that Mrs. V is a snob, hoity-toity, too good for him. Okay, got it, too good for him. Okay, so how does he act toward her? Let's look back. How does he act toward her? Okay, we only have a little bit of their interaction. Okay, it's really at the end here. So he says, Madame, right? So Eddie is respectful. He understands his role. He don't like it, but he understands it. It's respectful to Mrs. V. Okay, anything else that you notice there? Anything else you can infer about their relationship? Let's drop down here. She's going on and on about her parakeet. Oh, he's just lovely, but he didn't come back and he's never done this before. It's most peculiar. No, madame, I haven't seen him anywhere. He cuts her off. What does that say about Eddie toward Mrs. V? Eddie he's done. I did my job. I'm done. I'm out of here. Yeah. So Eddie he's a little dismissive at the end. He's respectful, but he's dismissive at the end of the day. He's like, I'm out of here, people. And we're not doing any more of this. Okay. So do you see what we did here? Okay, so let's just throw a couple details here. Again, you don't have to have a oodles here. It's really more about their relationship, but you want to at least think. What does Eddie think of himself? What does he think of his job? He hates it. He hates his lot in life, hates his job, had it for 10 years and still hates it. What else? What does he think of himself in terms of his situation? Blast, I've done it again. Yes, he's frustrated with himself, okay? And the whole cigarettes and the lump, okay? So we just want to get a sense of Eddie, okay? What does Mrs. Vanbruch think of herself? Yeah, she wants the best. She's very aware of appearances, okay? We know that because she's always changing her carpet, aware of appearances. What else about Mrs. Vanbruch in relationship to the parakeet? She's the caretaker. She's very worried. Okay, so she's worried, she's concerned because this is her pet and I'm in charge of this pet, this young life, right? Okay, so this is what we're learning to do. How do you kind of draw some conclusions about character relationships? First, you look at characters individually, or at least the main character, in this case, Eddie. I only did do, say, think for Eddie. All right. But then using those actions, words, and thoughts, I started to look at his actions, words, and thoughts toward Mrs. V and hers toward him, his reactions to those. Right. And we're starting to get a better idea of the relationship between these two characters. And why do we do this? What's the whole point of this kind of thinking besides, you better understand the passage? Well, again, a lot of theme. We're learning more about the characters. We're learning more about their lessons. We're learning more about how the author developed them. And so all of this is going to help us not just comprehend the text better, but get closer to what's the point of this story. Okay? Because we read these kinds of things for a message, a point. All right. So if you were in Mrs. Smacken's class, I would give you a new passage, one you haven't read yet, and it's called Thank You, Ma'am by Langston Hughes. All right, here it is on the screen, and I went ahead and made the margins pretty wide and opened up the spacing between the lines, so it does go 2 pages, but it's really not all that long, and it's definitely not that hard of a read. So the first thing I want you to do is there are 2 characters. There's Mrs. Jones and there's Roger. Okay, here's what I want you to do. Mrs. Jones is our main character. I want you to just read this, and I want you to mark what Mrs. Jones does, says, and thinks and feels. Okay? Now, you can do it as annotation. So if you can print this or if you want to do it digitally, I want you to annotate what Mrs. Jones does, says, and thinks. If for whatever reason you can't do it digitally, then you can just grab a piece of paper and create your own do, say, think chart. Okay? And just keep a running list. Just make a timeline on a piece of paper of what Mrs. Jones, only Mrs. Jones, does, says, and thinks. Okay, you can't talk about the relationship of 2 characters if you don't understand the main character. So you cannot skip this part. You have to know what she did, said, and thought in general in order to then do the second part. This is a twofer on this lesson. Then I want you to fill out the interaction tracker, or I want you to make your own, all right? And yours wouldn't have 3. It would just have 2. It would have a Mrs. Jones and a Roger, a Mrs. Jones and a Roger. And all I want you to do is start to bullet out, just like we did with the carpet fitter, start to bullet out. What do we know about how Roger feels about Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Jones towards Roger? What do we know about their relationship? Okay, we'll come back to this in the next lesson, but let's start to think beyond individual characters and start to notice their relationships. If you were in Mrs. Smecken's class, that's what you would do next, but your teacher might have a better idea.